All right, my Bible in 365 brothers and sisters, we have arrived at the incredible prophetic writing of Ezekiel. And folks, this one is major. Now, of course, we know that Ezekiel is numbered amongst what we call the major prophets. And I want to remind you that the reason why we refer to people like Ezekiel as a major prophet does not relate to the significance of the prophecies that they provided, but they more relate to the size of the body of work that they provide. So it is very interesting because those that we refer to oftentimes as the minor prophets really aren't minor because the words that they share are incredibly and enormously significant, as you just heard when we talked about Obadiah earlier. Now, what we need to understand is Ezekiel has some very powerful things to say. Now, it is important to note a couple of things here. First of all, with a substantial amount of what Ezekiel has to say, understand they are talking about events that are actually happening right now in this moment, or events that are about to happen, or events that have yet to come. And in reality, some of the events that have yet to come are a little bit a ways away, but the initiation of that process is literally around the corner. Now, we should talk really about a little bit of history when it comes to the subject of Ezekiel. And I do think that it is important that we talk about it for just a moment. So let's start with a little bit of history because it is important to understand this because this dynamic is critical to the timeline. Now, there were several prophets that were contemporaries of one another during the time of Ezekiel. The two that we want to focus on right now are for purposes of establishing this discussion and this timeline. One, of course, would be the prophet Daniel. The other one, of course, would be the prophet Jeremiah. Now, they all had virtually the same message, but they had different roles, and the context in which their messages were provided were also very unique and very different in many ways. Now, the one thing that I think we should talk about is the dating of all of this, because when we look at the prophet Jeremiah, because we should start with him, when we compare all three prophets, Jeremiah, of course, would have been the elder statesman. He's the one that told the southern kingdom of Judah, hey, beware, y'all are about to get beat up by God through Babylon and you need to repent. And of course, they did not want to listen. So what basically happened was there were 3 sieges that God had used to, in essence, seek to open up the eyes of the southern kingdom. And by the time they got to the 3rd siege, their eyes were undoubtedly open. But let's talk about this for a second, because the first siege by Nebuchadnezzar against the southern kingdom of Judah took place in 605 BC. By the way, I want everybody to understand when we talk about the term siege, people think that a siege means you're running after the city and you're just going to flatten it. Well, in actuality, what a siege is when you surround the city almost like a blockade in a way, and you actually starve out the city. And then in their moment of weakness, you then rush it. So there were 3 sieges that took place with Nebuchadnezzar and the southern kingdom of Judah. The first siege happens in 605 BC. Of course, that siege was not completed, but in that siege, there were people that were taken away. Now, the first person that we know of that was taken away in that siege would have undoubtedly been Daniel. He was taken in that siege in 605 BC. And we read about the narrative of what Daniel went through starting in that moment. Now, it's interesting. Daniel came from a kingly line, and in coming from that line, one of the things that should be noted is the fact that he actually ministered to the kings that actually succeeded one another as they continued to move forward after the initial siege of Jerusalem. Now, this is very important to understand because that would mean that Daniel's ministry was prominently one to politicians. That's right. And he was remarkably affected, very much loved and cherished even by these enemy states, which is really unique and really powerful because Daniel was undoubtedly a patriot and he also loved the Lord and his ministry was effective. And he makes for a good argument as into why we should be engaging in these areas. But that's beside the point. Daniel was that first contemporary, that first prophet. Again, Jeremiah being the elder statesman. So Daniel gets taken away in the first siege. The second siege, which takes place in 595 BC, is the siege that Ezekiel is taken away in. and that's where his ministry is. Of course, the third siege is the one that happened on the 9th of Av, 586 BC, when, of course, we know that Jerusalem was destroyed. And quite frankly, we believe that roughly 500,000 men, women, and children were killed on that day in Jerusalem. What a tragic day. And of course, the history of Jews being suffering at the hands of very wicked people is a long established history, and it is quite unfortunate, as we can even see demonstrated in the modern day with Hamas. Now, one of the things that we should note is Jeremiah told everybody, pack your bags because you're going to Babylon. And when everybody got to Babylon, Ezekiel was like, you better unpack your bags because you're going to stay here for a while. And that's in essence what Ezekiel did. He went out of his way to make sure that there were a series of things that he discussed. He talked about the fall of Jerusalem. He talked about God actually judging all of the nations that contributed to the fall and the breakdown of the whole kingdom of Israel, both united kingdoms and the whole nation of Israel. And then, of course, he begins to talk about the promises of restoration. And this is the area that I want us to emphasize for just a second, because it is so remarkably and critically important. And that is Ezekiel 36, 37, 38, and 39. Now, of course, once we pass Ezekiel 39, you're going to want to focus on that too, because it is talking about another temple. This is not to be conflated with the Antichrist temple that we know will be rebuilt very, very soon and will be the tribulation temple. This is a temple that we will see in existence literally at the time of the millennium. Now, he talks about that after this 36, 37, 38, and 39 sequence that I'm talking about. But what is very important to understand, and it is absolutely critical to know this and to understand this, when we start in Ezekiel chapter 36, we begin to see this progression where the Lord begins to declare that he will bring Israel back into her homeland. And what is so powerful and what is so remarkable is since 1948, and actually before that time, since the late 1800s, we were watching the beginning of Ezekiel 36 and 37 take place. Now they have their ancient capital back. They are a nation. They are literally exactly everything that Ezekiel said God would be doing, and they continue to move forward in that direction. Now, in Ezekiel chapter 38, which, by the way, I should say this right away, Ezekiel 37 is not completely done yet, but we do know that based on 36 and 37, God would bring the Jews back into their land even in unbelief. And there is a massive secular humanist population amongst the Jews that exists right now in Israel, yet they are back in their land, and God has done that miraculously, and Ezekiel said that that would be the case. And in Ezekiel 38, we are looking at the declaration that God makes concerning a battle that will be happening where there will be a series of nations or a conglomerate of nations that will be pursuing Israel and attacking Israel, led by one person by the name of Gog. Presumably, he is the leader of Russia from the region of Magog. And what will be interesting is when they come down against Israel, they will do it when Israel is in a time of peace. Israel will be surprised by it. And of course, when it takes place, it is going to be significant. Interestingly enough, there will be nations that will object to this attack, and they're all going to be friends together. And of course, the most prominent of those nations that will object to the attack will be one, Saudi Arabia. That's right. Now, they will not participate militaristically speaking, but they will vocally express their disgust with the attack. And the Bible is right. Now, it's really funny about this because we would look at this even a few years ago and think, what an impossible scenario. Yet now we're beginning to see relations with Saudi Arabia normalizing between them and Israel. And it is interesting, even with the recent things going on with Gaza, we're still not seeing much of that changing. We think that it's going to still go in that direction. Now, this is really important to us because if you know this stuff and you recognize it and you realize it, then it will also influence your geopolitical perspective on things around the world. This is the reason why I continue to say that Ukraine is absolutely a bad thing that we are getting involved with in the United States of America. By the way, let me just simply say this. There's a lot of reasons why getting involved with Ukraine is a bad thing, but we all know that the United States of America is pretty much defending its clandestine operations in Ukraine at the hands of the president's handlers. But that's a whole different story. We're not going to even get into that. But we know that Ukraine is not going to prevail in this. Why? Because Russia will be prominent. It will be one of the world powers that we read about in, of course, the book of Ezekiel, which is why we can make these very confident assertions regarding the position of many of these nations, because if you know the end game, then you're able to effectively analyze the geopolitics of the region and come to sound conclusions. There's a lot more than that in Ezekiel, and I would heavily encourage you guys to go through all of my teachings in the book of Ezekiel. There are a lot of them. I think you guys will be blessed. And I got tons and tons and tons of videos on Ezekiel 38 and 39, 36 and 37, and 40 and up. You will love it. You can go over to jamescadiz.com. You can go to my YouTube page. I have them everywhere, and hopefully you will be blessed. They're all free, and they're designed to bless you and to help expand your knowledge of the Word of God. There it is, folks. That was a big one. That was a long one. This might have been the longest video I've done, but it's well worth the explanation. God bless you. And by the way, I'm proud of you. I cannot believe it. November the 5th, we are fastly approaching, very quickly approaching Thanksgiving, which means Christmas is around the corner. I love it. Love you guys. God bless you. Keep fighting the good fight.